Well, thank you for joining into this conversation. Now, in this particular discussion, we're going to look at those particular gaps that occasion the relapse or the re-entry into violence in post-intervention regimes or states, using the particular case of Kenya. Now, the gravity of the atrocities committed during manifest conflict is characterized by killings by internal displacement of persons, instances of refugee crisis, and oftentimes instances of sexual and gender-based violence. So in situations of conflict, the local actors, both state and non-state, have to initiate mechanisms to try to contrive the reality of peace. Now, in situations when these local actors are unable to resolve a conflict, international actors may come into this conflict situation to try to bring the conflicting parties into consensus, to try to address that particular conflict. Now, these particular international actors may be intergovernmental organizations, such as the United Nations. They may be regional arrangements, for instance, the African Union, or even the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. Now, when these international actors come into a conflict situation, they try to bring these conflicting parties into negotiations through mediation. Oftentimes, these negotiations culminate into the signing of political settlements, or more specifically, peace settlements. Now, the signing of these peace settlements signify the cessation of hostilities and oftentimes pave the way for the return of peace and stability in countries experiencing conflict. Now, there is observed a phenomenon in the international system whereby states that have experienced peace as a result of international interventions experience this peace for a relatively short period of time. Then there is observed that re-entry or the relapse into violence. Now, that's what we're calling this conversation, the relapse or the re-entry phenomenon. Now, the re-entry phenomenon has been experienced in the region for quite some time. For instance, the case of the signing of the BCC Accords in 1991, for the case of the Angola crisis, the Rome Peace Accords for Mozambique, signed in 1992. We have the Arusha Accords signed in 1993. And in 1994, we see the Rwanda genocide, the 2000 Arusha Accords signed in the case of the Burundi crisis. We also have other instances such as the Cotonou Agreement in 1993, signed in the case of the Liberia crisis and the relapse that followed thereafter. So many other cases, the Khartoum Peace Agreement signed in 1997 in the case of the Sudan crisis, and the Algiers Agreement in 2000, the case of the Ethiopia-Eritrea crisis, the Global Political Agreement signed in the case of Zimbabwe in 2008, the agreement on the resolution on the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan signed in 2015, and most recent the case of the Juba Peace Agreement signed in 2020 in the case of now the Sudan crisis, the Sudan conflict. This re-entry phenomenon has been observed elsewhere. For instance, the case of the FARC crisis in Colombia, the Taif agreement in Lebanon, and the continued, re-entry phenomenon observed in the case of the Israel-Palestine crisis, the Camp David Accords, the Oslo Accords, and the like. And in the particular case of Kenya in 2008, after the electoral conflict, the international intervention that was initiated courtesy of African Union good offices, eventually culminating in the signing of the National Accord in February of 28 February 2008. Of course, with the signing of the National Accord in 2008, there was observed that intensified international interventions by both state and non-state actors in the country. Now, these interventions by these international state and non-state actors advanced the quest for conflict transformation in the country. There were a series of interventions that were initiated in the country, especially in the period after the signing of the National Accord. by intergovernmental organizations, by advocacy agencies, by media, by research agencies, by financing agencies, by judicial interventions, in this case the ICC and the TGRC mechanisms. Now, all these interventions were geared towards advancing the quest for peace in the country and enhancing effective conflict transformation in the country. Now, 2017, the country observed this relapse or this re-entry into violence. This violence was observed in some parts of the country, specifically in Nairobi and some parts of Nyanza and Western Kenya. Despite these many interventions that were initiated by these international actors, both state and non-state, especially in the period from 2008 to 2017, the country experienced that relapse during the 2017 elections. Although the gravity of the violence that was experienced in the country was not to higher levels compared to what was experienced in 2007 and 8, that relapse into violence in post-intervention regimes in Kenya attracts questions. The need for interested practitioners, peace practitioners, to try to understand what occasions this re-entry into violence in post-intervention regimes. A review of the interventions that were initiated in the country following the 2007 electoral violence would demonstrate that these track one actors, these international state actors, have that legitimacy. They have that diplomatic leverage that is able to bring these conflicting parties into consensus, which oftentimes culminate into the signing of peace agreements. These track one state actors have that legitimacy because their interventions are anchored on existing international regimes, for instance, the Constitutive Act of the African Union or the Charter of the United Nations. And so therefore, when these international actors come into a conflict situation, they are able to deploy that diplomatic leverage or that legitimacy to bring the conflicting parties into negotiations that culminate into the signing of peace agreements. However, these international actors suffer some key challenges. It is evident, based in the case of Kenya, that international interventions in conflict situations almost end immediately after the signing of peace agreements. In the case of Kenya, after the intense negotiations from 1st of January or through to the 20th of February, after this signing of the National Accord, we see this Africa panel of eminent personalities leaving the country into other intervention spaces. And so therefore, there are not well-established mechanisms for observing the implementation and the monitoring of the peace agreements that are signed in states that are recovering from conflict. The fact that these international actors, these eminent personalities, are able to lead the conflicting parties into the signing of peace agreements, the fact that they leave immediately after signing of peace agreements without established mechanisms for implementation or monitoring of these peace agreements occasions that relapse, because oftentimes you find that the provisions of these peace agreements are not implemented to the letter of as indicated in the peace agreement. In situations when the incumbent fails to address or adhere to or to comply with the provisions of particular aspects of the peace agreement, then there is observed that relapse or that re-entry into violence. Again, an observation made in the particular case of Kenya is that these international interventions, these peace agreements that are attained as a result of interventions by international actors, is that the mediations or the interventions are exclusive to the political elite. That these international actors come into a conflict situation, they look at the conflicting political elite and engage this political elite into negotiations. They mediate into this conflict by only engaging the political elite. In the case of Kenya, we had the Serena team, where the conflicting parties, especially the leadership of the ODM and the leadership of the PNU parties, were involved in the mediation led by the African Union panel of eminent personalities. These interventions, these negotiations, while involving the political elite, rarely do they engage the grassroots networks, the grassroots communities that are involved in these antagonisms. And so therefore, eventually, the signing of these peace agreements is seen more of a political assignment, where the political elite come into the negotiations as guided by the mediators. And once the interests of the political elite are addressed, then therefore the peace agreements are signed. So at the end of the day, the peace agreements appear to be more of power sharing agreements than peace agreements. And that's where, in a situation where the power is not equally shared, or in situations where there are violations of provisions on power sharing, we see that relapse into violence. Another observation in the particular case of Kenya is that these international interventions by these track one actors are more of events than processes. The process of conflict transformation is a process that is long term, and in particular case of these interventions, these international actors come into a conflict situation as an event. They just come in when there is this violence. They bring the conflicting parties into negotiations, in consensus building, consensus seeking. And once these agreements are attained, these international actors leave the conflict settings and go to other intervention spaces elsewhere where there may be happening conflict. And so therefore, the fact that these international interventions, the track one actors see interventions as events and not processes. Once they leave, they are not structured mechanisms as to how the continued implementation of recommendations for peace are done. And so you find once these international actors leave the intervention spaces, especially after the signing of the peace agreements, there are no structured mechanisms to turn the intervention from an event to a process, perhaps with continued review or monitoring mechanisms that can ensure that the provisions in the peace agreements are implemented. You look in the case of Kenya, after the signing of the National Accord, there were this many interventions that were initiated. For instance, the case of the CPEV, the Commission into Investigating the Post-Election Violence, commonly referred as the WAKI Commission. We look at the IREC Commission, commonly defined as the Kriegler Commission. We had other mechanisms such as the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission that was enacted in 2010, a rigorous process eventually producing 4 or 5 volumes of a really good report. After this report was presented to the presidency, it has never fully been adopted or debated in the National Assembly. And so therefore, recommendations, for instance, the implementation framework, the reparations committee, such interventions, such recommendations for interventions that would actually eventually lead to effective conflict transformation are rarely implemented because these international interveners leave intervention spaces immediately after signing of peace agreements. And so therefore, the interventions are seen more of as being events than processes. And as we may acknowledge, the conflict transformation is a process that cannot be attained immediately after the signing of peace agreements. It's a sustainable long-term process that would involve institutional reforms, constitutional reforms, structural reforms that would address existing perhaps historical injustice or structural inequalities that occasion that relapse into violence in the first instance. Again, another observation in the case of Kenya as to why there is this relapse or this re-entry into violence in post-intervention regimes is the issue around how the sequencing of peace and conflict interventions in international interventions are done. As part of the prescriptions after the signing of the National Accord, you see recommendations such as the establishment of a special tribunal to try the perpetrators of the electoral violence. At the same time, we see interventions, for instance, the case of the International Criminal Court that came into the country in March of 2010, when the International Criminal Court process was initiated in the country following the adoption of the Rome Statute through the enactment of the International Crimes Act 2008. We see this antagonism arising in the country, considering that the signatories of the National Accord were perceived to be the alleged perpetrators of the 2007 electoral violence. So we here observe that the international interveners come into a conflict situation. They bring the conflicting parties into signing a peace agreement. And at the end of the signing of this peace agreement, they make prescriptions that can attract a relapse or re-entry. For instance, when you see this, national accord with prescriptions for international judicial interventions, especially in the case of a special tribunal for Kenya. And so therefore, the sequencing of peace and justice interventions in post-intervention regimes can actually attract that relapse or that re-entry in situations where justice interventions or judicial interventions appear to threaten the prescriptions of the peace accord, where the prescriptions for judicial interventions, the local tribunals, issues relating to the ICC, if they are initiated immediately at the signing of peace agreements, there is that always likelihood of the relapse into violence. Again, another observation made in the case of Kenya is that these international interventions in conflict situations are involuntary. There is a lot of diplomatic coercion that eventually leads into the signing of peace agreements. In the case of Kenya, following the outbreak of the violence, we see the African Union coming to place, the then chairperson of the commission, John Kufuor, deploying the African Union good officers into the conflict situation in Kenya. We see the other international actors coming in immediately, deploying the responsibility to protect regime. But yet again, we see this diplomatic coercion. For instance, the case of the United States claiming that they are now going to conduct business as usual in Kenya. We see diplomatic threats. For instance, the case of the EU in Kenya declaring that they're going to serve bilateral relations in Kenya. We see issues about non-recognition of the Kibaki regime as threatened by the UK. This diplomatic coercion makes these interventions appear more of involuntary, and so therefore the peace agreements that are eventually signed at the end of these interventions are more of involuntary agreements, where these perpetrators or these signatories into these peace agreements end up signing the agreements in fear of those diplomatic threats or that diplomatic coercion, concerns about non-recognition of government, concerns about bilateral disengagements. Such diplomatic cohesion can lead to the signing of peace agreements that are rarely implemented, because once these peace agreements are signed, these international actors leave the intervention spaces, and so therefore the implementation of these peace agreements is left at the mercy of the signatories into the peace agreement, specifically the incumbents, who can choose to implement or not implement these peace agreements. Another observation is that these international interventions by these international actors are more reactive than preventive, particularly in the case of Kenya, where there are early warning signs that there would be violence. For instance, in the case of 2007 violence, there were early warning signs in the country that there would be violence. We had the media, the hate media, the hate speech that was being perpetuated by vernacular radio stations, pitting one community against the other. You would hear these narratives about the indigenous foreigner discourse in the country, of which communities belong to what part of the country. That narrative was highly inflaming during the campaigns, especially after the failed 2005 constitutional referendum. There was heightened ethnic antagonisms in the country, especially perpetuated through hate media. Evidently, there were narratives about the arming of militias in the country. Yet, despite all these early warning mechanisms, the international community did not deploy preventive diplomacy and waited until the outbreak of the violence, the killings, the displacements, is when we see the international community coming into the conflict situation to try to mediate into the conflict situation. So that kind of reactive approach towards addressing conflict situations in the region is a factor that contributes into the relapse or the re-entry into violence in post-intervention regimes. Now, despite these gaps in these track one actors, we see that there are other actors that come into place to respond to the gaps observed in track one actors. For instance, we have these peace building IGOs. In the case of Kenya, we had the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, coming into initiating interventions in the country, working in collaboration with other state actors, for instance, the case of the National Steering Committee, working with other agencies, for instance, the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, through the Wiano Platform for Peace, with a view to initiating interventions that sought to consolidate peace in the country. We see other actors such as the private sector. In the case of Kenya, we see the Mkenya Daima program initiated by KEPSA. We see other interventions by faith-based actors, the Amani Mashinani program, the Peace Connector projects that were initiated by the Catholic Church, specifically the Catholic Diocese of Eldoret under the leadership of the Reverend Cornelius Coril. Many programs, interventions initiated by the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission across North Rift. We see this many other non-state actors coming in place to respond to the gaps that are observed within the interventions by track one actors. We see interventions by advocacy and activism agencies, for instance, the case of the United States Agency for International Development, calling for political action, calling for reforms in the country. These continued interventions by these non-state actors in the period after the departure of the track one actors eventually keep advancing the conflict transformation discourse in the country. Well, despite this, non-state actors coming in to fill the gaps in track one actors, based on the strengths that they have, the grassroots networks across the country, the technical expertise, especially with international governmental organizations involved in peace building, such as the UNDP, that technical expertise, those grassroots networks, such are opportunities with which these non-state actors come with a view to responding to the gaps experience observed in track one actors. However, these non-state actors still suffer challenges. For instance, where we see state interference, we see this state interference whereby we see state actors interfering with the activities of these advocacy agencies. For instance, in the case of the USAID, where we had the state terminating a program, the Yes Youth Can program. We had the state withdrawing the work permits of the International Foundation for Electoral System, IFES Kenya, revoking the work permits. So there are those concerns about legitimacy of these non-state actors that come into conflict situations with a view to responding to the gaps in track one actors. We have other concerns about legitimacy, especially when these international actors are accused of programs that are geared towards regime change in the country. In the case of the 2013, 2017 elections, there were concerns that these international organizations were perpetuating regime change discourses in the country in the guise of civic education. There are also other concerns about how these international interventions by these actors are initiated in the country. Concerns raised about the timing. Oftentimes, these international interventions initiate interventions for peace in the country, especially towards election, a year to elections during the election year. And once the elections are done, these international actors, both state and non-state, leave the country and go into other intervention spaces. There is also the observation that these international actors deploy a top-down approach where programs for peace are developed within cities, formulated within cities and deployed down at the grassroots without that continued consultation at the grassroots level with a view to attaining those social licenses that are needed in the implementation for conflict transformation interventions. There are also other concerns that are raised as challenges that face these international interventions, both state and non-state. Concerns raised about gatekeeping, that these international actors, especially non-state actors, have established intervention spaces. And in these intervention spaces, they control the interveners that come into those intervention spaces. They control who would be the target beneficiaries of these interventions. And as such, therefore, there is that duplication of interventions within the same interventions space due to that continued gatekeeping of international interventions. There is also that concern raised around gendered interventions, that there is that observed continued involvement of men. Peace and security issues in the country are more seen to be a province of men than women, despite the continued public awareness on the need to deploy or to engage the women agency in interventions for peace. There is that observed continued domination by men in discourses relating to peace interventions in the country. Well, despite the agencies, the women agencies, especially in programs like the Rural Women Peace Link in some parts of North Rift, in Eldoret, where we see the Rural Women Peace Link deploying the women agency in programs towards advancing the conflict transformation agenda in the country, there is still that continued domination by men on matters relating to peace and conflict interventions in the country. Allow me to perhaps conclude by saying that in order for there to be effective conflict transformation, in order to constrain that re-entry or that relapse into violence in post-intervention regimes, there is the need for these international actors to continually work with the local actors, need for that continued discourse on conflict transformation in the country. There is also the need for engaging communities at the grassroots level instead of just deploying these international interventions from uptown offices in Nairobi, then having those programs implemented at the grassroots level without that social license that is needed for local ownership of these international interventions. Of course, matters relating to the need for compliance and cooperation on judicial interventions that seek to advance the quest for retributive and restorative justice interventions in the country. In order to constrain that re-entry or that relapse into violence in the country, there is that urgent need for that establishment of the intra-systemic and the inter-systemic relationships between these non-state and state actors with a view to establishing an infrastructure for peace in the country, of course, regulated or coordinated by the National Steering Committee Eventually, the continued interventions for peace by the state and non-state actors will eventually seal any gaps, any loopholes that can attract the relapse or the re-entry phenomenon in Kenya's conflict transformation agenda. That's how we end this session. Thank you very much.